Hello and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast about what's relevant, what's important, and what's meaningful. It's where we address whether the numbers and analytics we see daily are incredibly useful or nearly insignificant. I'm your every person host, Brent Buckwright, here with two experienced experts who have been analyzing big data since before it was big. If you took a random sample of their names, they'd be called Woo and Bro. It's Dr. Nathan Woods and Dr. Steve Bronars. How you guys doing?
Doing great.
I'm doing great. Thanks, Brent.
After the runaway interest in our latest sampling episode,
who knew we had so many listeners?
I mean, it's just on everyone's tongues. We knew we would have to follow up with an absolute banger. So we thought we would throw our hat in the political ring and talk about some of the sampling and survey problems related to the presidential election and any potential non-response bias issues that might come up. So non-response bias is the potential skewing caused by the fact that the population who were sampled but didn't respond might have some characteristic that's different from the population that did. So let's kick things off with some perceived controversy from, sorry, just checking my notes. It says the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
It's a thing.
Yeah. Okay. It seems that there's an issue that's come up.
It's just like the FBI, only for labor.
Yes, of course. Yes, it seems that an issue has come up, which is the fact that in August 2024, the BLS revised its estimate of the number of jobs added from April 2023 to March 2024. They had stated 818,000 fewer jobs were added to the economy over that period than expected. That seems like a pretty big shift. Steve, I want to throw it to you first. What kind of thing causes this reevaluation, and what makes it so important?
Well, Brent, I think that the way in which the BLS can benchmark the number of employees is only once a year. It's in March. So that's why they're going to say, in March, we're going to sync things up based on a more comprehensive census of the businesses that are contributing generally to the unemployment insurance system. That covers almost all the businesses. So you have a pretty good idea every March how many businesses are out there and what their payroll is. And then in all the other months, they're basing it on a survey. And, Nathan, when we were talking about this before, I said, I think the response rate is between 60 and 70%. That was true 10 years ago, but time really flies. And I went back and I looked, it's down to 43% response rate.
So can we just all agree right now and forget about 10 years. Let's go back 20.
I didn't check that. I don't know. But the response rates have been trending down. And what does that mean? Well, when you think about 818,000 jobs out of a labor force of 160 million, that's not that far off. But the key number that the BLS is trying to provide information about is what the growth in jobs is, what the change in jobs is. And so this is a little bit different kind of non-response bias because it's very hard for the BLS, and they're aware of this, to know when they get a non-response, is it that the business that is providing the information on how many workers on their payroll that they chose not to respond this month, or have they gone out of business? And so it's very hard. There's a term of art that they use for births and deaths of businesses. And obviously in their sample frame that they set every March, if a new business starts, they're not responding because the BLS doesn't know how to include them in that. So they could be undercounting in one direction if they're missing new startups. But in the other direction, if businesses are shutting down, although they're trying to adjust for that, it's very difficult to do. And so the 818,000 presumably was due to more businesses shutting down over that 12-month period than they had built into their forecast. And so that's why the number needs to be revised. But really, it's something that's very difficult to do in between the censuses that they have every March.
And so they're able to adjust that number based on some external to their monthly surveys, additional piece of information that comes in. And so they can solve for it at least at some point. It's not like it'll never be known.
Right.
But
it'll be never be known in August, because the census comes in March. It's like in March, what is the number of businesses that are out there and how many people are on their payroll? And then they do the surveys to get the incremental months in between, what I'm calling a census is when the administrative data can be used to count everybody. And so that way you would never really know, right? You're always coming up with an estimate of that. And I think the problem that they're facing is that fewer and fewer businesses are interested in responding to these surveys. And so that gives you a bigger margin of error. It's really what we would call non-sampling error, because it's not like, oh, the sample isn't big enough. It's like, well, we're just missing a bunch of the businesses just not responding at all.
And I would say, obviously we're big fans of the BLS, and, there's a little bit of a political uproar about that adjustment. And maybe there is even a kind of a policy question about, sure, it would be nice to have more accurate data more regularly or something like that. But what stands out to me about this example is you've got the survey, you've done the best you can, but then there are these other means by which you will validate whether or not what you're learning from the survey is correct or close to correct. And then you're able to come back and after the fact, make that adjustment.
Yeah, I would say that you are, but I think that there's such interest, and it's, there is some political edge to it, but like every business show is going to make a big deal about these monthly jobs numbers that come out the first Friday of every month, basically. And when you think about what the margin of error is on this, it's a little bit interesting that they put so much focus on that, because it's a very hard number to estimate. And you realize it is an estimate. And, it's just interesting to me how that is like going to be the headline. And, the next time the numbers are released, there's going to be a lot of attention paid to it. And I just think, from our point of view, maybe smoothing it out a little bit would, get rid of some of these imperfections in the data. But this other idea that there's a reason why there's these non-responses, that you're only going to be able to figure that out until the next March comes around, right? It's like you can do the best you can to say, well, maybe some of the non-response is really businesses that went under, but it's a very, very hard thing to do. And so I think, I said this probably in some other podcast as a takeaway, like just, be aware of the limitations of the,
and there's two sets of folks that have responsibility for that. One is the BLS. When they're putting it out there, they should be properly caveating and not overselling the precision in the numbers that they've got.
They should just put an asterisk next to the number.
Just the one asterisk.
Yeah.
But the other thing, and this is what is really kind of out of their control, is the people who are going to consume that in the media and then report that out. They've got some responsibility to be thoughtful and properly caveat as well. So, I mean, I think it's a hard thing to get right, and there's always trade-offs in terms of, do I want to share the information if it's not perfect because it might be helpful? Sure, I probably do, but I'd like the people who are consuming that to do so in the spirit in which it was intended.
So no survey is perfect, right? And no one is more leery of surveys than the American public, who widely question the reliability of presidential race polls, especially over the past few election cycles. Not responding to pollsters is now practically a political pastime. But how can non-response affect this view of, like a presidential race or what people are talking about now?
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, any non-response in any setting means that the people who you tried to contact that you were not able to contact are not random. There is something about the people that are responding in the way in which they're answering your questions, which is systematically different from those people that if you had gotten a hold of them, would have been answering something differently. So whether it's a political poll or going back to the BLS example or something that we would be working on, it's the same fundamental problem. So you've got to do several things, but the sort of top line, you got to convince yourself that you have a way of overcoming that, and that you can convince yourself, based on whatever adjustments you can make to the people that did talk to you, that your result is inclusive of and representative of the people that would not talk to you.
And I think that, in academic studies that rely on surveys, sometimes you compare what you think the non-respondents what their responses would be to the individuals that you had to nudge a few times before they did respond. Because you have the people that respond right away, and then the people that are recalcitrant, but eventually they respond. And if they look different, that would give you a peek at maybe the people that never responded look different as well. But I think now also in some of these polls, they compare to like prior elections and go like, hey, I think we're undercounting through non-response different groups. And I think, either one of those, it's doing something, but I'm not sure how much faith you can have in that. Whatever that process is, you're able to, kind of get around this fundamental problem that people just didn't respond to the survey.
Right? Yeah. And whatever those adjustments are, and the different polls and the different, organizations that are sponsoring those polls, there's huge quality differences between them, and some are probably doing it better than others. But whatever the adjustments are, your survey has to pick up at least enough of the people that you're going to adjust from. So you don't think you've got enough union members in, Springfield, Ohio. You can't just multiply that out to get to the right weighting on that number, right? If you didn't get enough to begin with, you're not confident enough in the result that you've got, given you only picked up 2. Well, that's not probably enough to weight up to represent that entire population. That's where we talk about oversampling or stratifying, and making sure that you've got an adequate sample to begin with before you start thinking about whatever adjustments you might want to apply. And then if you are applying those adjustments, that's where you get into, especially in the political polling, and to Steve's point, there's a lot of art to that based on insider knowledge and what do I think based on what I learned the last time around or what might be different this time around.
Yeah, and there's another kind of difference between political polls and, say, what the BLS is doing, in that the BLS, while it's regular, it makes adjustments, it goes back and looks at it, it's one organization that's doing the same kind of survey sampling again and again and again. Whereas with political polls, it's lots of different organizations doing them as frequently as they possibly can. So maybe if there's some characteristic of non-response that's occurring that you might get from one organization, you might not see it across all organizations. So you could look at polls as a cluster and see where trend lines are moving. There's another feature which I think is kind of interesting about them, which is that what you're actually measuring is how people feel, and that subject is, I think, qualitatively different than just the number of people who are working at a particular point in time, or the number of jobs that are out there at a particular point in time. That part of it is this going to always be this ephemeral, hey, this is trying to measure whether or not someone would vote for a particular candidate or party. And that can fluctuate, over any particular period or across different people.
Yeah, and I think that as and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Nathan, but as you get closer to election day or early voting or whatever, sometimes you're looking at registered voters, sometimes you're looking at likely voters, and it could be that if people aren't very enthusiastic about, the representative of their party that's on the ballot, the turnout might not be as good. And so
right.
If they did vote, this is how they would vote. But if they're like, you also have to try to figure out because the goal is not to say, well, if everybody voted, what would happen? But among the people who are going to vote, how are they going to vote? And so I think that's another issue.
Well, and I think in more recent election cycles for president, at least, the idea of the electoral college and the fact that this becomes very important state by state, I think that matters a lot more now than it did, for example, 20 years ago. Although maybe it was about 20 years ago that it started to matter. but yeah, so it's you kind of compound the issue, which is you probably need a pretty good survey in a state that matters. And when inside that state, whatever those kind of weighting and, after the fact adjustments you're going to make, those should be very much tailored to the circumstances that are on the ground in that state. Right. And that could vary, the going back to Ohio maybe is going to be different than, Nevada or some other state, North Carolina, Virginia, whatever.
In the good old days, Nathan, if one party put up a bad enough candidate, it didn't really matter. Popular vote, electoral college, it was going to be a clear and decisive winner. But it seems like these days it's going to come down to the same 6 or 7 states, right? Because the other states are like, they're sort of, they're already filled in with the red or the blue. And so I think that's kind of different. I think is that what you're talking about relative to, I think it's more than 20 years ago, but it was like, okay, we kind of know how this is going to turn out.
In a lot of places.
In a lot of,
no, right. But the idea, and I'm trying to kind of dovetail with your point, Steve, that the people that are not responding to the survey in one state might be different from the people that don't want to respond to the survey in another state in terms of who their true preference is. And so if that's the case, then whatever your adjustment is going to be probably needs to be tailored to the circumstances of those individual states. And it can't just be I did this kind of nationwide sampling, and then I've got some kind of couple of adjustments for whether you're truly a likely voter based on my own kind of recipe for identifying those.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, Nathan, if I can ask a question here. So you see these,
I'll allow it.
You see these state by state polls. And sometimes they'll go, let's say, like, well, here's how the Senate race is doing there. And then you can compare it to the presidential race. And I think you can learn something from that. I'm just not sure what it is you learn about how that might play out in that state. Because sometimes you see it in one direction, sometimes you see it in the other. And so that's one thought I have. And the other one is like, when you add the two main candidates together and you come up with a number that's way like below 90%, I'm like, okay, we're looking at the difference between these two, but there's like maybe not today, but there are times when it's like there's some undecided people that could break either way at the last minute. So I think sometimes they just focus on that difference and they go, it's 46 to 44. And you go like, yeah, but that's only 90. And unless the lesser party candidates get 10%, the other 10 can go somewhere,
Right. Which parallels a little bit the non-response point, right? The folks that are choosing the third party, if they break systematically for one of those two main candidates, then it's not just going to
right. It's not going to be that 2%. Yeah.
So political polls and job surveys seem to show two different sets of standards for how we look at a survey and the credibility we are willing to grant it. I want to talk a little bit more now about how we use different kinds of surveys and how the standards for our work, the assumptions that we're willing to put in and the limitations we face in doing a survey can be very different and present unique additional challenges, especially when it comes to a non-response bias.
Yeah. I mean, so we are typically not putting out surveys on our own, but we run into, in our casework, examples where a survey might be proposed to, all of them have in common that you're trying to ask a question about something for which there is no data. And whatever that subject might be, it might be about figuring out what kind of job duties somebody is engaged in because there's a misclassification claim, or it could be an allegation of working off the clock, or which you don't have the information because it's off the clock, or at least allegedly is, or you took the meals according to the data, but maybe that's not accurate, and you really were forced to miss those meals even though they were recorded. So at some point there's some aspect of the claims in the case where there is no data to inform, or at least allegedly there is no data to inform the answer. And so a survey will be proposed, or maybe it'll even be executed. And this same kind of concept of non-response, among other biases, there are other things you could be concerned about, self-interest of participants, or whether or not they can recall things accurately that might have happened a long time in the past. But this non-response point, whether it's the BLS data or a political poll or in our work, is an important one, because in order for you to kind of believe the result that you're seeing, you have to convince yourself that the people who did not respond would have answered just like the people who did. The higher that kind of refusal rate, or the lower the response rate, the more you're concerned about it. And the more important it is, I think, to be proactive about having some means by which to validate or convince yourself that maybe it's believable. I mean, the BLS has a way, it's imperfect, but they come back and they say, we're going to adjust these numbers. The surveys we're talking about for political stuff, you can either compare them with other surveys at the same time, but you certainly are going to find out eventually, based on who wins the election, what their vote share is, whether you were right or wrong. In our work, it's a little tougher, because if the answer comes back, it's a certain way. If you haven't built into the survey, or you don't have some means by which to validate that the respondents at least look like the folks who did not respond, you never know. And there's not a great way to gain confidence that that answer is reasonable or accurate.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting difference, because if that kind of information is available in the administrative data and the regular record keeping, you wouldn't be doing this survey. So you're only doing it because that is the way that you're going to be able to learn that information. And then I think you need to have a way of trying to show that it's the numbers that you're coming up with are reasonable, because you don't have these other kind of checks. Like if you operated a poll, or the BLS was off by not 800,000 jobs, but 8 million, you'd go wait a minute, why are we believing these numbers? And so they always are being kept honest by comparison to the actual outcomes.
Right. And in our line of work, it boils down to how representative the data really are. And we're doing the best. I think everybody would agree you got to do the best you can. Well, I shouldn't probably say that. There are probably some people who disagree. And you shouldn't do the best you can to draw a representative sample by, drawing at least at random. But if the group that is agreeing to respond to you all, they're all former employees, might be systematically different from, say, current employees. And if you don't get any of the current employees, or you're undersampling on the current employees, then the sample that you're talking to is not representative of the proposed class. And I don't know how you get around that. It's you might just say, well, we can weight up based on the couple of current employees that answered, but then you start to really worry that your whole estimate of what the current employees might have said is based on those two people. And how confident are you in that? So that's a real challenge, and I don't think there is an easy solution to that. The only way you can convince yourself, maybe, and I don't think it's sort of you definitively say, okay, I'm done, I feel great about this, is to check on some other dimension that you can, current versus former, how many people are in certain departments or certain jobs, or when you worked during a class period.
Do you remember how often you worked, or how long your hours were, or anything like that?
Well, that would be more kind of your recall accuracy, and which is a whole different kind of bias. And you could be remembering events that stood out because they were so egregious, but maybe were not typical. And so that's sort of a whole nother category of potential bias. But at least in terms of this kind of non-response thing, you can say, I'm going to at least ask questions about the person who's answering, so that I can compare that with the company data, where I can tell how many people are in which jobs, or how many people worked in different years during the class period, or how many people work in different departments, whatever it might be, the current form or example I already gave. And if my sample looks, like that real data, then maybe I can convince myself that the results they're giving on the questions that I had to ask them, because there is no data on them, are at least going to be coming from a representative sample.
Well, StatPack, as we say it of significance, sample early and sample often.
Sample well.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.